Hi, this is Mark Arnold with another episode of Fun Ideas Podcast. And today I have another person who's an Ed Wood aficionado. He's involved with two different books about Ed Wood. We had Paul Apel a few weeks ago talking about a football script that he had done in the past. And then this is a collection of, or two collections of like short stories and writings that of Ed Wood, and one's called "When the Topic Is Sex," and the other was called "Angora Fever." I know they have longer titles than that. You can fill in the blanks for
Right,
me. Yeah.
right.
So here we have Robert Blackburn. How are you, sir?
I'm good. You can call me Bob. Like
Bob.
Robert's what lawyers would call me, or the police officer, or somebody at the hospital or something.
Mr. Blackburn.
Yeah, exactly. I'm good, man. Thank you much. I really appreciate you doing this. It's exciting to talk about Ed, the
Mhm.
little bit that I know, but I had a interesting friendship with his widow, Kathy.
Oh,
So
okay. Because that
uh,
was like one of my first questions. How did you get involved? Why are you such a fan? You're probably a fan before you met her.
I
No.
was
Okay.
not.
Oh, wow. So, how did you encounter or meet her?
Well, and actually, it's interesting because this is going to be a memoir that is going to hopefully, well, it should be published this year, which is the 100th anniversary of Ed's birth. It's his centenary,
Mhm,
and it's called Kathy Wood and I, and it's going to be through Bear Manor.
mhm,
In fact, Ben Omar was the one who suggested I write this. He and I had been corresponding because of the other two anthologies of Ed's work. He said, you've got an interesting story about your friendship with Kathy Wood. Have you ever thought about doing something? And I thought, well, I kind of had. And I'd written a few things down, especially after she passed away in 2006. But to get back to your original question, I moved to Hollywood in March of 1989, and I moved into an older building, a five-story apartment building, a few blocks away from Hollywood Boulevard and Vine Street, literally 3, 4 blocks from Hollywood and Vine, famous intersection here in Hollywood.
right.
And I used to see a little old lady was out there walking her dog every so often, and she was my neighbor, and I would just pass her in the hallway and say hi and things like that. And our building at that time, Hollywood was still a fairly rough area. The gangs controlled it, and on the weekend nights, you'd hear sirens and the occasional gunshot, to be honest. And we had a mix of people that lived in our apartment building, older retirees, young aspiring actors, transvestite hookers, the whole 9 yards. And I went to a movie festival, an Ed Wood Film Festival in 1992. So this is like 3 years after I'd actually moved here. And a couple of guys who ran Hollywood Book and Poster this one summer in 1992 were doing these weekend film festivals related to cult movie directors or themes like Biker Chicks from Hell or something like that.
Mhm.
And they did this Ed Wood one called the Ed Woodathon, and I'm not sure if it's written backwards, so you kind of can't see it, but I still had the original flyer.
Mhm.
And they over the course of a weekend, they screened all of Ed's well-known films at that time: Bride of the Monster, Glenn Glinda, Bride
Yep.
and the Beast, which involves a gorilla, and that's a whole nother thing. Glen Glinda, The Violent Years, and of course Plan 9 from Outer Space.
Ta-da.
There you go. Absolutely. And during the course of this weekend, they also had some of the people that had worked or known Ed come in to do a little bit of a Q&A, including Vampira, Paul Marco, who played Kelton the Cop, Conrad Brooks, I said Matt Vampire. Forrest Ackerman was there. So a bunch of people in the world of Ed Wood that were still alive at that time
Mhm.
who had worked or known Ed were there. And I'm just kind of soaking it in. To be honest, your first question about me being a fan of Ed's, I was aware of Ed and I was aware of Plan 9, but I had not seen any of his movies. And that
Mhm.
was one of the reasons I went to this film festival, is to kind of jump into the deep end of this filmmaker called Ed Wood. And one of the things they also showed some kind of rare home videos, home movies, and some commercials that Ed did back in the 50s when he first got to Hollywood. But they also had a British documentary, The Incredibly Strange Film Show,
Mhm.
which back in the mid 80s did other cult film directors, hosted by Jonathan Ross, who is a BBC presenter, as they call him over there.
Mhm.
And as I'm watching this documentary, I see an interview with this lady, and it says Kathy Wood, Ed Wood's widow. And I looked at this woman and I thought, God, she looks really familiar. And I was sitting next to a friend of mine who played in a rock band called the Muffs here in Hollywood in the early 90s. And I turned to her and I said, God, I think that lady lives in my apartment building. And she said, Really? And I said, Well, when I go home tonight, I'm going to check the mailbox. I knew what apartment this lady lived in. She was apartment 202. And I get home and I look at the mailbox and it says K Wood. And I went, uh-oh, I think this might actually be Ed Wood's widow. I bumped her into her in the hallway about a week or so later, and I asked her if she was indeed Mrs. Wood, and she got all defensive, like, yeah, why do you want to know? You know, that kind of. And I explained to her about this film festival of her husband's movies, and she got all pissed off
Ooh.
because she wasn't invited.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that, but I figured tell your story. Why wasn't
Yeah,
she there?
and so she said, "Well, who was there, and what did they say, and blah blah blah, and why wasn't I in it?" And later on, I found out that she had like a secret phone number you had to call. Like you call, ring once, hang up, call back. So nobody associated with this festival were able to actually get in touch with her and invite her to this screening of all her husband's films. So anyway, uh, now all of a sudden I realize that this lady lives in my apartment building, and I think, well, that's cool. You know, I mean, I worked in radio, and I was seeing well-known music artists and stuff through the place where I worked at. It was a national radio network, and Johnny Mathis would show up, or Dolly Parton would show up. So I kind of got used to real celebrities, and that was an interesting thing. But a month or two later, I went to see my friend's band play, the Muffs. They were playing at the Whiskey A Go Go,
Mhm.
and I bumped into the boyfriend of the girl who played in the band, who I knew. And he came up to me and he said, "By the way, was that Mrs. Wood that you ran into at or that lived in your apartment building?" And I
Mhm.
explained to him, I said, "Yeah, it was." He said, "Well, I heard that Tim Burton is making a film about her husband starring Johnny Depp."
Mhm.
And I kind of went, "Oh, weird." And so the next day I went down to her apartment and I knocked on the door, and just to ask her if she was aware of it, because I had a feeling that she probably didn't know anything about it. And I met her kind of again for the first time and told her about this film, and I asked her if she would be interested in me finding out if that was in fact going to happen or if that was true. And she
Mhm.
said, "Yeah, if you would." And the next day at work, I called Warner Brothers, and because I know that he had done like Batman Returns, or yeah. In fact, her first comment when I mentioned Tim Burton, she said, "Pee Wee's Big Adventure,"
Right,
because
right.
that was the one film of his that she was aware of. So I
Yes.
thought that was kind of funny. But I did track down uh, his production office. Turned out that they had been trying to get a hold of Mrs. Wood
Mhm.
because she was going to be a character in the film Ed
Right.
Wood, and she was played by Patricia Arquette.
Mhm.
And oh, here, this is a picture of Kathy and Patricia Arquette that I took when they had
Ooh,
lunch. At,
okay. There we
is
go.
that better?
Yeah.
I
Wow.
just wanted to make sure that people can kind of see that. And
Cool.
once Patricia decided to sign on for the film, she wanted to meet Mrs. Wood.
Mhm.
So they arranged for us to go out and have lunch, and that was the one time that we got to do that. But again, long story getting longer here, obviously. Um, so after finding out that yes, indeed, they were making a film and Johnny Depp was going to be in it, and that the originally Columbia Pictures was going to produce it and put it out, turned out to be Disney eventually.
Hmm.
Um, I they sent me a little kind of a contract. They because she didn't have a fax machine, I had a fax machine. They said we're trying to. She needs to sign this thing because she's a character in the film, and we want to give her a little bit of money because we've heard that she's impoverished and blah blah blah.
Hmm.
And I kind of read over this 2 pages, and they were going to give her like I don't know $1,500 or $5,000 for her life story, blah blah. And I thought that, and I showed it to her, and I said, I think you might want to get an entertainment lawyer.
Yeah.
And she said, could you help me? And I eventually found one through a film editor friend of mine, and his name is Bob Weinberg, and he became her entertainment lawyer
Mm.
and helped her deal with the Disney people who by that time were making the picture. And from that point forward, since she was my neighbor, she became my friend, and I
Hmm.
would come down and visit her after I got off of work and from my radio job, and we'd go grocery shopping. We'd go to movies. She being with Ed. She always loved films anyway. She loved them as a young girl, and would go see them when she was a kid up in Vancouver, British Columbia, where she was from originally.
Hmm.
And so we would go see movies together, and I was with her through thick and thinner, and, until she contracted cancer of the esophagus in 2006, and she passed away. And it turned out I and Bob Weinberg became her two heirs,
Mm.
which in a roundabout fashion makes me one of Ed Wood's heirs,
Hmm.
which if you would have told me this when I moved to Hollywood in 1989, I would have just said, no, 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 that's impossible. But it that's what it is. And so I've tried to keep, and I've learned a lot about Ed from being with her. I wish I would have known more when I was with her because I would have asked her more questions, but she might have got defensive and thought I was more like a fanboy and, kind of not wanted to be around me that much.
Hmm.
But we were just friends. So I would come down to her apartment after work and she'd tell me stories. And that was always a lot of fun. That's what's going to be in this little memoir that Ben will put out here later this year.
Okay.
And after she passed away, I started collecting some of these short stories out of the men's magazines. Ed worked for a girly magazine publisher called Pendulum Publishing in the late 60s, early 70s. And at that time, eBay was selling adult materials on their website, and I would go on to the adult pages looking for these magazines that had stories or articles by Ed, collected them all. I actually put out one book prior to working with Bear Manor.
Mm.
Um, it was called, I know this is all backwards, so
That's
it's
okay.
called Blood Splatters Quickly. That was the title of one of Ed's short stories, and it was published through or Books out of New York, and it has like 33 of Ed's other short stories in it. And when I went to try and do a second volume of it, they weren't interested. And then I found Bear Manor and Ben was all excited, and he said
Yeah.
yes because he'd already put out a few books to Gary Rhodes, some of the Bela Lugosi, Ed Wood scripts and things like that. So he put out Dolores Fuller's autobiography also,
Hmm.
which so Ben kind of has this Ed Wood thing going on anyway. So he was excited to do this. And we have some other projects down the road that may or may not happen. So I shouldn't talk too much about
That's fine.
those,
Yeah.
but knock on wood.
Knock on Ed Wood. Yes.
Yeah.
um,
Bingo.
different questions that came up. Did Kathy Wood, I'll just say her
Yeah,
name.
yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Just get.
yeah. Did she see the finished product of the Ed Wood film, and did she
Oh
like it?
yeah, yeah. She liked it for the most part. mean, we were both really aware that it was a biopic,
Mm.
and they were kind enough to send her a copy of the script before they even started filming. So we got to read through it ahead of time. The way they meet in the movie didn't happen. I mean, like maybe 75% of the Ed Wood film is correct and actually did happen. A lot of it's is based on factual things that did happen. Some of it, though, is embellished just by the screenwriters, by Tim Burton himself, just to kind of because it's a movie. So,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
want to do that. But the way in the movie they have Ed and Kathy meeting is Bela Lugosi has been is at a mental hospital to overcome withdrawal symptoms from his opiate addiction, and Ed goes up there and he's waiting. And he meets this cute girl who's knitting booties for her father. And when Kathy, first time Kathy read that in the script, she cackled. She says, "Booties? I've never knitted a booty in my life." And she
Mm,
kind of she was a little upset,
yeah.
but it turned out that Scott Alexander, one of the writers of the script, he told me later, and he told her that it was a nod to his grandmother who used to knit booties, so it was a little inside thing for one of the writers. So
Mm,
so she got over that. The one scene though that she had a hard time dealing with, even though it did happen,
mm,
was after the rap party for Bride of the Monster, where Ed dresses in drag and Corlett Panda is playing the organ, and Ed comes out and he's in drag and he does a big dance, and then he pulls his fake teeth out and stuff.
yeah.
Kathy, it was the one, even though this was before Kathy's time with him, by a few years, 3 or 4 years, she still kind of got upset seeing him portrayed that way in the movie.
Hmm.
She had no problem with Johnny Depp being dressed in an Angora sweater and a skirt, um, and she was okay with that. Fact, when they first started shooting the movie here in Hollywood, she was coming home from the grocery store one afternoon and saw um, the production. They were shooting. She said it was an alleyway somewhere here, and she was walking home and she stopped. We both knew that they were going to start shooting at some point soon. Didn't know where, didn't know when,
Hmm.
but she stopped and just had a feeling. She says, and she saw a security policeman there, and she says, "Well, what movie are they making?" And this officer said something about some Ed Wood character, and she said, "Oh, that's my husband." And one of the writers, Scott Alexander, was actually there that day, and he got all excited. He went over and introduced himself to Kathy, and took her over to meet Tim Burton, and the producer, Denise Denovi, was also on set and asked her if she would like to meet Johnny Depp.
Hmm.
She said, sure. So they took her to a trailer, and he was all excited. He wanted to pick her brain and talk to her a little bit about, Ed, because he was playing him.
Hmm.
Even though he'd done a lot of research, he'd seen all the movies, he'd seen, and read everything he could get his hands on in order to portray Ed. And she chatted with him for about an hour, and I think she kind of fell in love. She was smitten. Here she was, a lady in her early 70s at this point,
Hmm.
and I could tell she had a girl crush on him really hard, and it was really kind of cute.
Yeah.
And they were shooting a scene the next day about 2 blocks from our apartment building here. I'm still in the same general neck of the woods. They moved me next door. When I glance over this way, I'm looking at the building we used to live in, and I
No.
live next door now. They In 2006, the same summer that when Kathy passed away, they were renovating the entire building. And they moved all the tenants out,
Hmm.
and they moved me next door because they own the same property. But back to this quick story. They were shooting a scene on Wilcox with Ed and Martin Landau, where Martin as Bela Lugosi and Ed are walking up the sidewalk, and Bela goes into his home, "I have no home" speech in the Ed Wood film.
Right.
And Kathy was invited, and she went down there, and Ed was Ed, it's the same thing. Ed was dressed in a suit, and she said, "He looks a lot like my Ed, but he's missing something." And she happened to have um, this. I don't know if you can see that or not. Does, does that make sense? There's
It's like
no
a
cards
wallet.
or any.
So
This is
it's
Ed's wallet,
okay. It's a wallet. Yeah.
and it had a few little papers and some things, and of course there was no money in it because Ed was broke when they got kicked out of their apartment. But
Yeah.
she loaned it to Johnny to wear, and he put it in his back pocket. And as he walked away, she said, "Now there's my Eddie." I don't know
Oh.
what it was about having the wall in the back pocket. So anyway, there's that. So
So, how did you come along to get like all these short stories? Was that through her or through different sources?
no, it was on eBay. I mean,
I mean, you mentioned eBay, but I didn't know if she had like a collection of stuff. So here,
well, no, I mean,
yeah.
in their personal story, they used to live in an apartment which is like right across from where I live. It's on Yucca Street, and it was an apartment they lived in here in Hollywood
Hmm.
from probably about 1975 to 1978. And Ed was drinking a lot, and his health was getting worse, and he wasn't making much money. And by the middle of 1978, they were missing their rent. Like even though the rent was like $150 a month in today's money, that'd be like $500 or $600. And they missed about 5 or 6 months in a row, and they kept getting notices like, if you don't pay up, you're going to get evicted.
Right.
Um, and by they couldn't pay their December rent in 1978. And on December 7th, 1978, the sheriffs early in the morning came and knocked on their door and told them they had to leave and they could only take what they could carry with them.
Mm.
And all they had was a suitcase and some papers and stuff. And they called a friend of theirs, an actor named Peter Coe, who lived in North Hollywood. And Peter said, just take a taxi up. I'll pay for the taxi, and you guys can stay here until you sort out your, difficulties and your problems. Ed had burned a ton of bridges by then. He had very few friends because he kept borrowing money from people and couldn't pay it
Mm.
back. And he was drinking heavily. And that weekend on Sunday, um, he'd gone into a bedroom to rest, and they had a football game on the TV. This is kind of where Paul got the title of the
Yeah.
I died early the day I watched TV, or I was watching football the day I died, or whatever that was.
Right. Right.
And they did have a football game on the TV, and a couple of people were there at the house. And Ed asked Kathy to go get him another drink, and she yelled at him and said, "No, you've had too much." And then they were in the living room, and then a friend of theirs walked into the bedroom and found Ed dead on the bed.
Mm.
And Kathy said he had his eyes open as if he'd seen the devil. That was her. That was the way she said it. And then Peter Coe, their friend, came in and shut his eyes for him. And Ed had been a Marine, so he was a veteran, and she had to deal with the Veterans Administration after he passed away. And eventually, she moved back to this neighborhood, probably 1980, 81, somewhere in there, a couple of years after he passed away. She kind of moved different places where she could. She had dogs, they were dog lovers, and they still had a couple of dogs. And then she moved back up to this apartment that I ended up moving into when I
Mm.
moved down here and stuff. So
I
it
never
was
thought
it.
I never knew that. I thought that he passed away in the building where you were saying originally, not getting
No,
evicted or anything. So okay.
no, yeah. And this was right on the cusp of his notoriety, to be honest with you.
Right.
Um, the Golden Turkey Awards book came out, I think, in 1980.
Yeah.
And that was the one that the two Medved brothers did,
Right.
where by popular vote, now the Medveds themselves didn't pick who the readers of their previous book, The 50 Worst Movies of All Time,
Mhm.
were encouraged to write in what their favorite worst movie was and who their favorite worst director was. Well, the overwhelming consensus was Ed Wood and Plan 9 from Outer Space. So I think Robot Monster was a close
Right.
second.
Yeah.
So that kind of started this whole ball rolling of Ed becoming the cult film director and filmmaker, with college film festivals and people trying to find all of these lost films and Rudolph Grace, starting his oral biography that he wrote called Nightmare Ecstasy, which
Hmm.
also came out in 1992. In fact, he was there at that weekend with the film festival. He flew out from New York to sell and sign copies of his book, and to I I can't remember him talking at the event, but I think he did a signing at the Hollywood Book and Poster bookstore, where were the guys who actually put on the film festival. So all of this just kind of started cascading, and over the last few years, there's been a lot of discoveries in the world of ed, like the script that Paul found.
Right.
There's a couple of like books that were thought to be lost that have been recently rediscovered and hopefully are getting published and things like that. So, and the world of ed is it's funny because I just jumped into the deep end, and I'm paddling. I like dog paddling, trying to stay up with all this, and I'm hoping that we can do some kind of film festival similar to this Ed Woodathon in October around Ed's 100th birthday. That's the dream. So
Mhm.
we're gonna see what we can do. But
That's really cool. Would that be done in Hollywood in your area? Then?
yeah, I think it would be fitting for it to be here in Hollywood and stuff. And
Mhm.
there's some interest already from like the screenwriters from the Ed Wood Film Festival are still both involved in film preservation and film history, as well
Mhm.
as being screenwriters, and they're both on board. And a couple of other people that are like Bobcat Goldthwait is a big fan of Ed's, and there are a few people like that that I'm sure would want to do something to help. We tried to get Ed a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame back in 1994 when the Disney film came out, but couldn't do it at that time. But some directors like Quentin Tarantino and John Waters and others actually wrote letters of recommendation that Ed deserved to have a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. But now it's like $75,000, and we can't raise that on our own. Back then the Disney people, as part of the publicity for the movie, were willing to take on that expense. Back then, though, it was I think 35 or 40 grand, or maybe even a little bit less. I can't remember.
Mhm. Now tell me a little bit about the book. So you've been collecting all this stuff, you said, for
Yeah.
did you have it were you collecting it just for your own amusement or
No,
enjoyment, or
no, no.
what was the reason why you were collecting it? Was it to
Uh,
make a book,
um,
or
Here, let me.
yeah,
I actually,
hold up
I
the
took,
first book first. Yeah.
I took a couple of. Uh, this is. I know it's backwards, but this is cherry. I
Actually,
don't
it's
know
not
if you.
backwards. It looks fine. It says adults
Does
only.
it?
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Well,
It might be on
then
your
it's
screen,
worth.
but yeah, it's fine
I
here. So
Yeah, maybe.
yeah.
Okay, we're good then. This is one that doesn't have any naked naughty bits on the front cover, so I had to get something that was presentable on what we're doing right now. But I would find um, things like, I know this is going to be kind of weird, but this is one of Ed's short stories called Insatiable.
Hmm.
And I love, like, they did a lot. They had different artists that would work for the magazine that would do different type of artwork and stuff. And I was just grabbing these off of eBay as I could. There's another one, Flesh and Fantasy. I purchased about 125 different magazines.
Wow.
Wherever I could find them, I would purchase them. Here's another one. This is called Blood Drains Easily. And these had both the short fiction in them, and they also
So
had.
Dick Trent is like a pseudonym or something?
Yeah,
Is
Dick
that what-
Trent was one of
Okay.
his aliases, as was
Okay.
Angora
Okay.
when he was writing
That
for
one's a
the
little more
lesbian
obvious.
magazine. Yeah, he was writing for lesbian magazines, and he would use Angora for the
Okay.
girl. And this is one of his articles.
Hmm.
And the articles were basically essays about different subjects that were like real subjects, like sex in Japan.
Hmm.
And he would just kind of riff on a subject. And how he did his research back then, I have no idea. Pre-internet, a lot of his stuff was actually spot on. Um, but the publisher needed to have both the stories or the articles in these magazines in order for them to be mailed through the U.S. mails. Otherwise, it would be considered pornographic material. But
Hmm.
if you had some redeeming literature, quote
Right.
unquote, or an article, fact-based article, you were allowed to mail the magazines.
Right.
So that's what Ed was doing. He was also writing some of the captions for some of the photo displays and stuff like that. And I mean, he was a jack of all trades at that time. Plus, he was also this was the early inception of the pornographic movie industry where they were doing the loops, like the 8 millimeter loops,
Hmm.
like 5 minutes, and they wouldn't show hardcore stuff, but they would have TNA and all that kind of stuff. And Ed was actually directing some of those and writing the little captions that would go along, like title cards,
Hmm.
like in old silent movies. So Ed was doing a lot of that. So some of his articles are actually about the burgeoning porn trade and, like how do you get into it? What does it entail? Things
Hmm.
of that nature. So, yeah, I was finding these and mainly to kind of keep a unspoken promise to Kathy to keep Ed's flame alive.
Hmm.
And I figured, well, this was an area that hadn't been tapped. And if I can find enough of these, and if I could find a publisher, it would sure be nice to get them out there for the Ed Wood fans, just the general. And the very first book actually got, well, they've all gotten interesting reviews. I'll put it that way. But for the most part, they've all been positive. And I think a lot of reviewers and even a lot of readers are surprised at how good some of the stories are. Ed loved twist endings, just like a Twilight episode. You like to have a little twist there at the end. So
Hmm.
Ed was good at that. And people ask, well, are they as good slash bad as the films? Well, yes, they're similar to that. I actually prefer his writings more than I do the movies, and I love the movies, but I think the writings are actually a deeper because there's more of them, and he riffs on a lot of subjects closer to him was like death and women's clothing and things of
Hmm.
that. I mean, we haven't really brought up his transvestism yet, but he was well known as a transvestite here in Hollywood. His first real movie, Glen or Glenda,
Hmm.
was probably the first major feature film that really focused in on transvestism. So
Hmm.
the LGBTQ community have kind of taken that to heart and stuff. And I'm trying to get a film screening. There's a local gay and lesbian center here in Hollywood, and I used to be a sound designer for plays,
Hmm.
and I did a few plays there, so I know some of the people, and I'm trying to have them do a screening of Glen and Glenda in October with drag queens and the whole 9 yards. So we'll see how that works out. I will let you know.
Okay.
You're
Um,
invited.
well, thank you.
You don't have to dress up,
All right.
or
um,
will I?
which of your books was the first one? Which one did you
Blood
release?
Splatters Quickly was actually the first one.
Okay. And are no, I didn't get sent a copy of that one, so I don't know
No,
what's in
because
that one.
different
Oh,
publisher,
oh,
different
I see. Okay.
publisher. Yeah,
Okay.
and I don't have a good relationship with them. They actually
That's okay.
have put out. Well, they licensed it to um, a company in Brazil that put it out, and I get no residuals or anything like that. I wrote an introduction to all three of the books,
Right.
and they don't have me list. They only have me listed as an editor, and not as like quote unquote owning the Ed Wood stories, which
Mhm.
as being one of the heirs of Ed's estate, I may or may not, but they didn't even see me as maybe.
Wow.
So I don't really have a very good relationship with them, but I have a really good relationship with Ben at Bear Manor. So
Okay. Well, since you brought up the first book, I still want to ask a couple questions about it, even if we're
yeah,
not
no problem.
talking about those. The theming of that is, did you try to keep it all to a similar theme that Ed was writing subject matter
No,
wise, or you? I mean,
the only, the only, go.
how,
I'm sorry. Go ahead and finish your
how did
question.
you compile these? I guess.
Well,
Yeah.
the very first one, since Ed wrote under these different aliases like Dick Trent and other people like that, The very first book, I wanted to make sure I have a copy of Ed's resume from 1974, 75, and he lists the stories that he wrote under the
Hmm.
titles of those stories. So I knew when I was looking for these on eBay, even if they didn't have Ed's name listed, if they said like blood drains easily or blood splatters quickly,
Hmm.
I knew from his resume that he had written it. So
Right.
I would purchase that magazine either by bidding it or buy it now. And when I got it, I would see if he used his own name. A lot of times he did. He used Edward Jr., and it was always Jr. Everybody just calls him Ed Wood. That's
Right.
because of the movie. I always call him Ed Wood Jr.
Yeah.
because he had a dad who was Ed Wood.
Well, it
Um,
does say Junior, like on the copy of the DVD here, Edward D. Wood Jr.
that
So,
that's how he signed his name. That was
yeah.
exactly what Kathy told me. She said, he would, in fact, when he would sign it shorthand, it would be EDW, like EDW dot Junior JNR. He was like old school like that. Um,
Yeah.
in fact, let's see if I can do this. So anyway, so the very first book, I wanted to make sure that all of those stories were Edward D. Wood Jr. stories. It was that
Okay.
they were signed in the magazines as Ed. I just because I didn't know if that might be the only book of his I ever got out. At that point, it was. So I just wanted to make sure that those were for him.
Okay.
And as I started collecting more, and I decided that I had enough to do a second book, I
Mhm.
approached this publisher, and I guess the sales weren't what they were hoping for. Blah blah blah,
Yeah.
and that's when I found Ben. And at this point, it didn't matter to me if they said Ed Wood or they said Dick Trent or they said Angora or any of his known aliases. So that's what we went with. And
Okay.
same with the articles. So that was basically it. Now, in as far as the articles, I did those are themed. I like sadism or cross dressing or lesbianism or politics. Yeah, Ed wrote like about the busing, in Boston and or um, uh, different, or film, because some of the chapters just like have to do with making movies, and then the other ones might have to do with sex around the world or articles that he found in the newspapers that titillated him and he thought he would share with his readers. I don't know who he thought his readers were, because I doubt they were actually reading. They were looking at the pictures. Let's not fool ourselves
Right.
here, right? So anyway, but I just wanted to show you this real quick. This is one of his books called "What's the Difference." It was a book. It doesn't have anything really to do with the Watts riots, except they're kind of a backdrop. But
Hmm.
this is, I don't know if you can.
You signed it. Cool.
Yeah. And this came from his personal collection
Uh-huh.
that Bob Weinberg and I inherited,
Hmm.
and we split them when Kathy
Now, who is Bob?
passed away.
Explain who Bob is.
Bob was Kathy's entertainment lawyer,
Oh, okay. Okay.
and
Oh,
he
that's right. You
became
mentioned him. That's right.
yeah,
Yeah.
and
I forgot his
he
name.
became he did a lot of work for her pro bono,
Uh-huh.
and he was a good guy. His hair's longer than mine,
Hmm.
and he and they became good friends also. So when she passed away, she divided her estate between the two of us.
I see.
And Bob is going through some health issues right now, so we've actually had to sell a couple of his signed books by an auction house, and we did two. Well, we actually sold six books last October. Three of them were unsigned. Three of them were signed, and we got $750 for one of the signed copies, but we got $3,500 for one and $3,700 for the other one.
Wow.
We have four more that are going to be auctioned here in mid-March,
Hmm.
and so we're hoping to get a little bit. If we could get close to that, we would be happy because it helps pay his medical expenses and stuff.
Right.
So, yeah,
Okay.
it's been kind of difficult.
So what was the first one that you did for Ben then? Which book was that?
It was Angora Fever.
Oh, okay.
And it was a guy, and I don't know if you'd seen the cover,
Yeah, yeah.
and this is actually Ed,
Right. Yeah.
and he's taken
I've
from
seen that.
Leonard
I've
Glenda.
actually seen that photo before, or I've seen the
There,
movie. So
there you
yeah.
go.
So I knew it was that immediately.
Okay,
What
that's
I
good.
didn't know when I got the books from you is was this writings of him or about him or by him, and then going through it, I go, okay, so he's written this, and
Right,
because
right.
I knew he did a lot of writing other
Yeah,
than doing films, but I didn't know to what extent. I didn't know which type of publications, if they're all
right,
below the board or whatever.
right, right,
Um,
right.
you know, uh, it sounds like he didn't do much mainstream stuff. Maybe some paperbacks or something like that at
Well, even the
best.
paperbacks were published by can I say mob controlled interests in the publishing business?
Sure.
I mean, they were for the adult paperback trade, even though they're the most unsexy books in the world. And
Yeah.
again, it was Ed just kind of riffy. He would come up with characters and scenarios and a twist ending if he could come up with something. And like Hard Boiled, they're very much kind of film noir-ish kind of
Mhm.
books. Like his first real novel that's well known is called Black Lace Drag, which was retitled Killer in Drag, and it's about a transvestite hitman for like the mob,
Mhm.
who, in order to do his hits, wears women's clothing so he can get closer to his victim and all that kind of stuff. And there was actually a sequel to that, which was Let Me Die in Drag. So
Mhm.
Ed would riff on certain things, and then like this Watts book and uh, one called Tony Black Tigress, and here's the Death of a Transvestite. This is the original paperback for that, and
Mhm.
this is one here. I should take this out of the little plastic covering so you can see the book clearer. This is called Drag Trade. That and I am 100% certain that that is Ed on the cover
Wow.
because it looks just like him. And it wouldn't surprise me if he said, "I'll pose for the photo. I
Right.
wrote the book. I'll pose for the
Why
cover."
not?
So,
I assume on your collections, there's nothing from those type of paperbacks because they're too long, right? Because you're focusing more on short stories. Is that correct?
I'm sorry. Can you repeat
You,
that? I
you,
got
you're in your books, you don't have anything from those paperbacks because you're
no.
focusing more on short
Yeah,
stories, right? Yeah.
yeah, and a couple of the paperbacks were legitimately republished in the '90s when Kathy was alive and had we Bob the lawyer had gotten her some copyrights on some of Ed's books. So those
Oh, that's
were
cool. Okay.
we were able to get some of those republished. There was like 6 titles that have not been republished yet that I'm hoping that Ben and I will be able to get those out down the road. Some of these books have been bootlegged and they
Yeah.
show up on Amazon and stuff, and I don't have clear copyright ownership because Edward Wright was, like I said, mob controlled publishers back then. We don't know
Mhm.
who these people were that owned these businesses.
Right.
If any of their, heirs still exist, I have no idea.
Yeah.
When I got these short stories republished through Ben and the other book publisher, I didn't get permission from anybody. I just assumed that, like being one of the heirs, I have as much claim to them as anybody. So let's just put them out there and
Right.
hope that nobody gets ticked off and comes after me.
Right. Fair
So
enough.
far, nobody has.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've lucked out.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping that that's the case with some of the paperbacks because a lot of the fans, the Ed Wood fans, have been clamoring for these. Anytime somebody posts about one of the books, like you can find them on eBay occasionally, but anywhere from like two to four, five, $600 for
Yeah.
a paperback.
Yeah.
So when somebody says, "Hey, I got this on eBay the other day and I read it and it's really great," and people go, "Well, why can't I get a copy of it?" And I want to make them available to the mass fans out there at some point down the road. So that's another check off for my list for Kathy Wood to, Ed, I'm trying to do what I can do to keep Ed's, his work and things that he did alive out there and stuff. So as far as the movies, we as the heirs have really no, as far as I know, any claims to them. We've never claimed to say that we have rights to them because the rights in the films are a lot goofier than they are to the publications. Wade Williams, who
Yeah,
recently passed away, claimed to have ownership of a lot of Ed's works, but
yeah.
that's
That's what
a
it
whole
says on
nother
this
thing.
on Plan 9. That's what I was checking.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. I mean, Wade's name is on pretty much a lot of Ed's works and stuff, whether or not he actually. I mean, if you tried to reproduce it and make your own video based on a Plan 9 film or something, Wade would have come after you claiming copyright for whatever reason, and he
right.
did do that.
Yeah.
So, but I don't know. So I don't worry so much about the movies.
Yeah.
There's been other people that have put out films that Ed worked on or has had some kind of connection to, and I would just like for them to be nice enough to send us copies of them, gratis, so I don't have to go out and buy, something
Yeah.
that has Ed's name on it and stuff.
Hmm.
One thing that I'm also hoping to do here in the future is Christopher Apostoloff, who is the son of Stephen Apostoloff, who is the film director that Ed worked with on things like Orgy of the Dead and Class Reunion and some of these like TNA films in the late 60s and through the 70s, has some unproduced scripts that I've seen that Ed wrote and his dad bought from Ed just to give him a few $100s so he'd get some booze and food and dog food and help pay a little bit of the rent. And I talked to Chris about, because I've asked Ben about this, us publishing some of Ed Wood's unproduced scripts. So hopefully that'll come out at some point this
Okay.
year too.
Cool.
And I have a couple other of Ed's scripts that were unproduced that weren't associated with Stephen Apostolop that I'm hoping to also get published at some point in time. Like Trial of Terror,
Mm.
kind of a jungle movie with a twist ending,
Yeah.
which I'm not going to ruin.
Going back to the writings that you're compiling and stuff like
Yeah,
that, more than the films,
sure.
um, do you know enough about what Ed did to get these assignments? I mean, I know you said that he was working with the mob, but I mean, was he given a topic to write on, or was he given
No,
free reign? Did he have a regular column, as it were, in these various publications?
he
How did
he
that
he
work?
was he basically he was a staff writer for Bernie Bloom, who ran Pendulum Publishing.
Okay.
So he would go to the office, and you know they were putting out I don't know how many men's magazine every month. I would say maybe 10 issues, maybe 20 issues with different titles.
Hmm.
Just a ton, and with different kind of orientations. Like they had one for voyeurs, like Peeping Tom's kind of one. So Ed might write a story that had that in as part of the hook for that particular story for that particular magazine. They did girl on girl kind of stuff. So Eddie would write as Angora, and he might have a story about lesbian seduction or something of that nature. So he would try and do his stories towards what he thought the readership would be, but no, it was a paid job. It was like he had a little office cubicle.
Hmm.
There were other staff writers that also wrote um, short fiction or articles or the copy for the photo layouts and stuff like that. So that was basically what he would do. So, but the novels, that was different. They would get paid a little bit more, like $300-$400 for a book, which Ed could type out within 3 or 4 days.
Hmm.
Basically, he would just sit down and he'd drink and smoke and maybe wear his out. His drag name was Shirley, so he would maybe get dressed and put on one of his Angora sweaters and drink and type and work all night and pop out a couple of books, yeah, every few weeks or every few months or whatever it was, just to help pay the rent and buy the dog food and the cigarettes and the booze.
Mhm. To your knowledge, was writing easy for Ed? It wasn't something where he got writer's block or something a lot
You
or
know,
anything.
I don't think he did. From all everything that I've heard, from what Kathy told me, and from what other people who are more expert on Ed than I am. I mean, he
Mhm.
won it supposedly when he was in high school. He won a contest in the state of New York for the fastest high school typist. So he could type very fast. He When he was in the Marines, he also worked in, even though he went overseas, he went to Okinawa and Tarawa and these other places. He was not in the first wave of Marines that would go in and stuff. He would come in maybe a week or so later, and he worked in the office of, whoever his commanding officer was, like a colonel so and so, that he was doing a lot of typing and things like that. And he was and stories. There was a couple of writers. Leo Eaton was a writer who went on to another career in film and other things. But as a young man in his 20s, he worked at Pendulum for a few months and got to know Ed a little bit, and was surprised because Ed would always tell him about making movies with Bela Lugosi, and this Leo guy was, there's no way this old drunk used to work or make movies with Lugosi and stuff. But he also said that Eddie was like one of the he would work. The other guys would goof around, but Eddie would be in his little cubicle because these were all younger guys and they're around all this TNA kind of stuff. They'd spend as much time looking through the magazines as writing for the magazines.
Mhm.
And Ed would just, that was his job. And he would just turn these things out. So
Mhm.
hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Um, Now, when I interviewed Paul Apel about that football story, one of the
right.
things he said was that was kind of out of character, for lack of a better term, for Ed because he wasn't really a fan of sports or anything like that.
Right.
In your compilations or things you may not have even compiled yet, what's the most out of character, extreme thing you've come across?
Wow. Boy, that's a good question. There was a book, and hold on 2 seconds here while
Sure.
I grab this. Um, Ed wrote a book. This is a reprinted book that is no longer in print. Sex, Shrouds, and Caskets. Um, there,
Wow.
there was a couple of books that Ed wrote where he did like case histories of sadists and murderers and serial killers of, like, oh God, like the 16th, 17th, 18th century, people's names. And at first I thought he made these up. I said, I never heard of this. I mean, I heard of like the countess that used to kill virgins and put blood in her bathtub and take baths in just virgin blood. I mean, I've heard of that.
Mhm.
But he had, I don't know, 9 or 10 different short sequences in this book. And as I'm reading it, I'm going on Wiki and I'm looking up, and I go, oh my God, this person actually existed. And that kind of blew me away because I don't know how Ed did that kind of research
Yeah.
in the 60s or the 70s. Even going to your local public library, which I'm sure Ed did because he lived fairly close to a couple, both when they lived in North Hollywood and then also here in Hollywood, they lived within a half a mile of a public library. So he had access to that. But where he got his information from, I have no idea. But that's the kind of stuff that just kind of knocked me out. I went, and he
Mhm.
never fails in his syntax. He has really weird syntax. And he also has some phrases that he likes to use in his short fiction that is unmistakably Ed. They're tropes that he uses, and words like capture. I can't even explain. Like, he captured her look. or something about the way he uses words
Mm,
is unmistakably Ed.
mm.
And he never fails to crack me up when I read something that I go, "Oh my God, that is just so Ed Wood." And those are in all of these short stories, and even in a lot of these articles and essays that he did. That he would go off on a riff, and some of these are essays. He does these fake interviews, like, "Oh, we spoke to so and so on the street about this or
Mm.
that," and he's just making them up. It's all fiction.
That's funny.
Sure.
Um, uh, I think Ed Wood's output seems very interesting, more than I would expect, just because of the wide variety of topics that he
Yeah.
covered. And it
Yeah.
is kind of interesting in what you were saying, that you always can kind of tell an Ed Wood piece.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
so in saying that, I guess at this point, I just wanted to have you, re-promote the books. You can promote the Bear Manor ones at least, and
Yeah. Absolutely.
if you want to order them, it's
So
through the usual suspects, but you can say how you can order them.
these are there, and it's Angora Fever, which are the short stories. They're fiction. And when the topic is sex, which are the quote unquote articles or basically essays, and half of them are fiction, because it's hard to tell fact from fiction with Ed sometimes. And to Bear Manor Media, and I want to thank Ben Omart for being so gracious in everything he's done. And hopefully down the road, we have some more projects that'll be coming out, especially to mark Ed Wood's 100th birthday. See, I said Ed Wood and I didn't say Ed Wood Jr., but I
Edward D.
shorthanded
Wood
too.
Jr.
Yeah,
I know I've been saying Edward too, but it is
I
habit out of the
shorthanded.
it is habit out of the film, because the film was called Ed Wood and it's easy just to do. So yeah. So
And
uh,
when people hear it, they know who you're talking about. So I just get picky about myself sometimes. But yeah, through Bear Manor, and I guess Ben is some of it's. I mean, you can go on their website, but I know you can also buy them through Amazon. So, and I was going to say finer bookstores everywhere, but I'm not really sure about that.
well, I know usually, because I'm also with Bear Manor for most of my books. You can order through Barnes and Noble and things like that. If you can't find it in the store, you can certainly order it through their websites. So
Well, yeah, yeah. There you go.
and
Oh, Mark, it's been nice chatting. Now, you live up in Springfield, right?
I'm in Springfield, Oregon. So,
I grew up in Portland.
oh, cool. Okay.
Yeah, my dad was in radio there.
Oh, very good. Okay.
Yeah,
So,
for many years.
very good. And one last thing, are you definitely doing this Ed Wood uh, show? You said, presentation or whatever. So when is that again?
Uh, I am hoping to have some kind of celebration for Edward's 100th birthday in October here in Los Angeles and Hollywood
Okay.
area. So more about that later. As I know more, I may drop it in the comments of this on YouTube.
Okay.
If this ends up on YouTube, I'll post in
Yes,
there
it will.
about it. And I do have, for anybody interested, I do have a private Ed Wood Jr. Facebook group. If you just search Ed Wood Jr., that to differentiate it from other Ed Wood groups, there's like an Ed Wood Appreciation Society and some Edward D. Wood Jr. group and stuff like that. But mine is private. And I just asked people to let me know what their interest in Ed is, and I'll be happy to add them. And it's a interesting mix. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Joe Blevins, who puts out the Ed Wood Wednesdays blog, which is on his. God, now I'm forgetting the overall name, but it is Joe Blevins Ed Wood Wednesday, and he's been doing it for seems like forever, but about 8, 9, 10 years. And he actually reviewed every single short story in these books and every single article and essay in both the books. And for a deeper dive into those stories and the articles, it's a good place to go too. So there you go. And thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you very much, Bob. And we've been talking with Bob Blackburn here about Edward D. Wood Jr. and his writings, his films, and other things. Hopefully, you'll get that show going underway for his 100th birthday anniversary, as it were. And look forward to some new books from you coming out in the next years or two or whatever.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay.
And it was a pleasure talking to you. And when another one comes out, give me a call. We'll have you back on the show.
Thank you so much, Mark. I really appreciate it.
All right. And this is Mark Arnold with another Fun Ideas podcast, and we will see you next time.